Last week, eggs went into my cart without much thought. This week, I found myself standing in front of the same shelf, quietly reading the price tag for longer than usual. The number itself didn't seem dramatic, yet somehow it felt like something was slowly changing in the background of everyday life. It wasn't only about what was left in our wallet. It was also changing the way I looked at every trip to the grocery store. I began noticing something that unsettled me. I wasn't only carrying groceries anymore, I was carrying worry, too. My name is Clara, and I don't want worries about money to come home with the groceries and settle into our family life. Morning begins with the familiar smell of coffee filling the kitchen. As I open my banking app, a routine that once felt ordinary now quietly holds more of my attention. Before writing a grocery list, I pause longer than I used to. My thoughts naturally move toward calculations before anything else. Across the table, Mira talks happily about something that happened at school. I keep listening, wanting to stay present in the moment with her. Even while she speaks, part of my mind remains somewhere else. The prices I saw earlier keep returning to the background of my thoughts. Milk, eggs, fruit, bread. Simple items pass through my mind one after another as I think about the week ahead. These used to be the kinds of purchases I barely noticed. Now each one seems to arrive alongside a quiet calculation. I close the banking app and look back at Mira. Then I gently smile, hoping she only sees the moment we are sharing together. During a regular grocery trip, I noticed a small change in the way I moved through the store. Something about shopping felt a little different than before. I found myself looking at price labels more often than the items sitting on the shelves. My attention kept returning to the numbers. I compared different package sizes before making a choice. Then I started checking the cost per ounce as well. I picked up an item and held it for a moment. Then I quietly placed it back on the shelf. A moment later, I reached for it again. Then the hesitation returned once more. At first, I assumed I was simply being more careful with spending. It seemed like a practical habit. But little by little, I realized something else was happening. I was feeling anxious before the shopping even began. I reached for Mira's favorite yogurt while moving through the dairy aisle. For a moment, it felt like any other item on my shopping list. Then I noticed the new price tag. The increase was small, but it was enough to make me pause. I took a slow breath before placing it back. Then I reached for a less expensive brand beside it. There was nothing wrong with choosing the cheaper option. I understood that as I stood there. Even so, a quiet thought stayed with me. It lingered longer than I expected. Was I giving her the best I could? Or was I only choosing what fit within today's budget? By the time I arrived home, the question was still with me. It followed quietly through the rest of the day. That evening, we sat down for dinner, the way we always do. Everything looked familiar, almost unchanged from any other night. Mira laughed when our man made a simple joke. For a moment, the sound filled the room more than anything else. No one complained about what was on the table. The meal carried on without any sign that something was missing. No one asked about the yogurt brand. The change stayed unnoticed as the evening moved along. No one could see all the calculations I had been doing earlier that afternoon. Those numbers stayed quietly with me. Then a thought came to me unexpectedly. I sat with it for a moment before looking back at the table. Maybe the heaviest part was not sitting at the dinner table. Maybe it had been staying inside my head all along. A few days later, I stood in the kitchen pouring cereal into a glass jar. It was one of those quiet moments that usually passed without much thought. I had bought the less expensive version that week. The box looked different, even if it served the same purpose. While I was finishing, Mira walked into the kitchen. Her footsteps quietly filled the room with company. "Mom, I like this jar," she said. Her voice carried the simple certainty only children seem to have. I smiled a little when I heard that. It seemed like such a small comment at the time. Then she added something that made me stop for a moment. I found myself listening more carefully than before. "For some reason, our breakfast looks more special now." I stayed quiet for a moment after hearing her words. That evening, Mira's words stayed in my mind long after the dishes were done. I kept replaying the moment while the house grew quiet around me. I realized how much energy I had been spending thinking about the things I could no longer afford. Those thoughts had quietly followed me through many ordinary days. Somewhere along the way, I had been so focused on what was missing. I hadn't been looking as closely at what I was still able to give. Warmth, attention, and time together were still part of our days. Those things had never disappeared from our home. Mira never stopped to think about the price of the cereal. That wasn't what caught her attention in that moment. She saw her mother preparing breakfast with care, just like always. That was the part she noticed. As I sat with that thought, it felt quietly important. Maybe that had been the thing that mattered most all along. After Mira fell asleep, the house became unusually quiet. I sat with Armand in the soft evening light, finally making space for a conversation I had been holding inside. "I'm tired," I said softly. The words felt simple, but they carried more than I had been saying out loud. It wasn't the grocery shopping itself that exhausted me. The bags, lists, and errands were never the hardest part. What wore me down was feeling like I was calculating all the time. Every number seemed to follow me long after the shopping was done. Armand nodded before saying anything. He already understood what I meant. "If we're not careful," he said quietly. His voice carried the same concern I had been feeling for weeks. "Inflation doesn't just take our money. It can take our peace of mind too." I sat quietly with those words for a moment. The following week, I decided to do something a little differently. It wasn't a big change, just a quiet adjustment before the usual grocery routine began. Before making my grocery list, I opened the refrigerator first. I stood there for a moment, looking at what was already inside. Then I checked the pantry shelves as well. One cabinet after another, I simply looked at what was already there. I started writing down what we still had instead of what we were missing. The list looked different from the ones I had been making lately. To my surprise, there were still plenty of ingredients we could use. More than I had been noticing during the past few weeks. For the first time in a long while, I felt a little calmer. Nothing around me had changed, but something inside me felt lighter. It wasn't because grocery prices had gone down. The feeling of panic simply wasn't sitting as heavily on my shoulders that day. I can't control the prices on the supermarket shelves. Some things change no matter how carefully I plan each week. I can't stop inflation from moving through everyday life. It keeps showing up in small ways, whether I notice it or not. But I can choose what I bring back home. Not only the groceries in my bags, but also the energy and mood I carry through the door. If this story feels familiar, I'm glad you found Clara's family journal. This is a place where we reflect on building a calmer family life when the world feels uncertain. Lately, what is one grocery item you've had to buy less often because the price went up? And how have you adjusted without losing the sense of happiness at home?